Well, thank you, Provost, for those kind remarks, and I share the very high opinion that I'm sure you all have of the late Christopher Hogwood, whom I knew, who was a truly remarkable man, and he leaves some very large shoes on this stage for some very small feet to fill this morning, but I will do what I can. Given the fact that guitars are, to say the least, a niche interest, I'm delighted to see so many of you here. My wife said nobody will come. I said, well, I don't know. No, she said nobody. Get used to it. Get used to it now. There'll be nobody. But there is. So thank you for that. And I hope you'll stay with me during the course of the 6 lectures, whose overall title is Men, Women and Guitars in Romantic England. And before I go any further, let me introduce for you the musicians who are going to be performing this afternoon. Our soprano is Valeria Mignacco, and our guitarist is Jelmer van Amersfoort, and Jelmer will be playing an original French guitar of the Romantic period, properly strung, but I'll come to that. Well, today, I would claim to you, the guitar is probably the most popular instrument in existence. It has millions of devotees worldwide, I think that's fair to say, and it eclipses the generally more expensive piano and allows a beginner to achieve passable results, don't you think, rather sooner than the violin, as surely every parent who's ever had a violin-playing child must know. Now, you might be surprised to discover that guitars of one kind or another have a very long history here in England. For example, Queen Elizabeth received a set of 3 guitars as a present on New Year's Day in 1559, and the original archive that tells us that has a little note saying in the margin, "with the Queen." What that means in a roll of gifts is that the Queen has specifically asked to have it brought to her so that she can inspect it carefully. Queen Anne, who died in 1714, also played the guitar, and her book of lessons still survives. I was playing through it just last night. But looking at the wider constituency, we find that gentlemen with positions in government have played guitars right back to the Tudor period, but so have apprentices on low wages. Soldiers have played it home from the wars, sometimes on the edge of poverty, but so have society ladies. In most countries except Spain, guitars have generally been regarded as foreign instruments, as you could say potentially untrustworthy migrants on the musical scene. Their fortunes have waxed and waned, but somehow, much to the chagrin of their critics, they've always managed to survive. Now, I don't mean to suggest, by giving you a conspectus of just how long guitars have been around, right back to Queen Elizabeth in 1559, that they've always been the same. Of course, they haven't. So I think we need to have a particularly close look for a moment at the beast we're concerned with today. Jelmer, will you brandish your guitar? Oh, you may need to stand. Thank you. So there you have a guitar made sometime, I should think, between about 1830 and 1840. That would be my impression. The actual length of strings is much the same as on a modern guitar, give or take an inch or two. But the body, you can see, is really smaller, so the sound is lighter. And the strings, of course, are not nylon. They're gut for the top 3. That's a sheep gut, though it's often cow or bull gut these days. And the bottom 3 have a core, originally would have been silk with a metal wind, but these days, because such strings are so unbelievably expensive to make, we tend to use strings with a nylon core. The sound is not vastly different. So there it is. There is a tame romantic guitar, which has agreed to come this afternoon. Now, in my first year as Gresham Professor, I'm going to explore with you, and I hope you'll stay with me, as I said, what this remarkable and enduring instrument meant to people in a time of really rapid social change, perhaps the most rapid England has ever known. I mean the age of John Keats, a poet about whom I have a thing. He'll keep coming up. William Wordsworth, William Blake, Shelley, Byron and Coleridge, the 6 so-called canonical Romantic poets. And it was during their lifetime, I think, then the last of them died in 1834, that the guitar emerged from one of its periodic slumps and began to become very fashionable again. When I say that it's always been around, that's true, but its history has rather formed a serpentine pattern. There are peaks and there are definite lows. And what I really am here to tell you over the next 6 lectures is that playing the guitar in the time of those poets was more than a matter of simply buying music, rehearsing it, and then giving, say, a parlour recital. What I would call the culture of the guitar also involved reading novels and serialized fiction in which the guitar appears. It encompassed reading poems in which the guitar is mentioned, even celebrated, and there are many of those. It involved buying prints in which the guitar appears in some kind of narrative or emblematic context. There was much more, in other words, to this musical instrument than music. Well, as for my claim that the guitar became fashionable again in the earlier 19th century, we really only have to look at the history of what you might call teach-yourself books for guitarists. The first was published in 1795 in London, the year that John Keats was born. And thereafter they keep coming. And I'm delighted to be able to tell you that the number of guitar methods published in London before about 1850 is actually twice as large as the tally of similar books for Vienna, the musical capital of Europe at the time. And here's another sign of a developing fashion. In July 1801, and I'm now talking about the image on the first page of your handout, in July 1801, an issue of the Ladies' Magazine offered its readers a print showing a woman in fashionable Parisian clothes with a guitar. As I say, you have it on your handout. You might notice, if you count them, that the guitar has 5 single strings. At this date, 1801, the instrument had relinquished the strings in pairs it had long shared with the lute, and it was about to gain a 6th string in the bass, making the 6 with which any guitarist is now familiar. I sometimes wonder whether this picture is following fashion, or actually, if you like, in a way, creating it. And maybe it's just me, but it seems to me that this image, like many that show women with guitars, is subtly, perhaps not so subtly, erotic. The flushed cheeks, the low-cut dress, leaving no doubt of the curves behind, the bare arms, and so it goes on. This is very much a woman caught in a male gaze, and we'll find that time and time again as we go through the course of lectures as a quality, if you like, of pictures of women with guitars, and it is very often women who are shown with them. We shall have a whole lecture devoted to that later in the series. Well, it's time to hear a romantic guitar and a singer. Here's a song by the French composer, a woman, Pauline Duchange, who died in 1858. It's entitled Canzone Amoroso, and it's the kind of song that young men and women in England, but especially, I suspect, young women, obtained from abroad in printed editions during the 1820s and 30s and learned to sing and play. So, Canzone Amoroso by Pauline Duchange. Canzone Amoroso by Pauline Duchange. Now, the craze for the guitar, I think that's the right word, actually. The craze for the guitar, especially as an accompaniment to the voice, reached its peak in England about 1833 to 1835, so not long before Victoria came to the throne. Now, one way to trace that rise, and indeed to prove to you that it happened, because up to now you've really only had my word for it, is to seek out the young women who offered their services as a governess and sought employment in private homes, the Sisters of Jane Eyre, if you like. Now, the graph on the handout on the next page shows the number of advertisements year by year, principally in the London press, placed by women seeking employment as a school teacher, a governess, or a companion, and including the Spanish guitar among the accomplishments they were prepared to teach. And you can see that it really rises to a very considerable peak in the 1833 period, having run up from about 1825. It's quite slow to start, surprisingly slow in a way. 1815, the year of Waterloo, also brings probably the finest guitarist who's ever lived to London, the Catalan Fernando Sor. And I suspect that that peak you could see just after 1820 is to do with him and the amount of teaching that he was doing in the prosperous squares of the West End of London. But as you can see, I think very clearly, it mounts up enormously. It's a very approximate measure, and the data has its limits. But I think as far as it goes, it's really, what it implies is really quite clear. Well, why did this happen? Why a craze for the instrument that you just heard? Well, part of the answer lies with developments in the instrument. As I said a moment ago, it acquired a sixth string in the bass around about 1800 in England, slightly earlier elsewhere, giving it greater capacity at the bottom of its range and enhancing its powers, therefore, as an accompanying instrument. Now, it has always been used in this way, back to the time of the Tudors, but the guitar had never been able to offer a true bass without compromise. Well, now it really could, and I'm sure you heard in that performance, as you will hear in some of the others that are coming up, how the thumb of the guitarist can pluck the lowest strings to give a fairly good sonorous bass. In fact, most of the writers who criticized the guitar in our period, and many did, and they often do it sharply, are actually praising it. What they really are trying to say is, don't play these tedious sonatas, don't try and be like a pianist. Accompany your voice. That's what's best. That's when the instrument comes into its own. I think we've already seen that, and we'll see it again. But for another reason why the guitar became fashionable, I'm going to turn to one of my predecessors as a Gresham Professor of Music, Richard Stevens. I was recently browsing in his manuscript notes for a lecture he gave one day in May 1829. Drawing upon his own experience, Stevens records that the tenor, Giuseppe Viganone, from the London Italian Opera, was a rather listless musician on the operatic stage, but, and now I'm quoting from Stevens' notes, in private parties, he used to accompany himself sometimes on the Spanish guitar, when his fancy, taste, and beautiful expression in singing were most uncommon and inexpressibly delightful. I've just transported you back to a Gresham lecture given nearly 200 years ago. I'm convinced that, because I discovered it, that some other well-known singers of Italian opera were also guitarists. In fact, I found them, Diomiro Tramezzani, Carlo Rovellino, from about the same period, the early 19th century. I suspect these Italians were much in demand for the kind of private party that Stevens mentions, and that they showed fashionable London society what a serviceable instrument the eminently portable guitar could provide for an operatic aria. What could be easier for a singer who was a success on the stage to simply transfer the accompaniment of his favourite aria to his eminently portable guitar, carry it to some West End party where he was much in demand, and earn a little extra money or a little extra kudos that way. And another thing that matters, but it wouldn't have mattered to people in the fashionable West End, is that guitars were really quite cheap, as in fact, of course, at the lowest levels of manufacture they still are. You could purchase a modest one for less than a guinea by the 1830s, and more cheaply still if you went to an auction. And remember, unlike now, it was incredibly expensive to have your household good transferred by wagon in this period, by road, and very laborious and expensive often to have them transported by sea. So when you moved house, it was often simpler to just sell everything and start again with new furniture at your new address. So there were constant auctions. They're always advertised on the front page of newspapers like the Morning Post, and they often mention what's going to be sold, and guitars very often feature. Now, my graph that you saw a moment ago about the one scientific thing I think I've ever done in my life peaked in 1833. Now, that was the year when guitarists acquired, believe it or not, their first ever niche magazine in English, the Giulianiad, named after Mario Giuliani, who had recently died, an Italian guitarist. Now, in one issue, the editors pose a question that I think is especially appropriate to my subject today, which is the romantic guitar. This is what they ask. What instrument so completely allows us to live for a time in a world of our own imagination? Well, what might that mean? Well, before we go any further, I'd like you to hear that combination of guitar and voice again. Now, obviously, the thing to listen to is the song. That's how a song works. But I think that if you attend also to the accompaniment in Jelmer's guitar part, you'll hear the thumb sounding the bass very clearly on the lowest strings, giving the kind of bass foundation that the guitar of 60 years before would not have been able to give. This is La Jeune Fille Russe, and again, it's the work of the female composer, Pauline Duchange. In the autumn of 1818, the Lancaster Gazette published a short essay on musical instruments, as I say, from the autumn of 1818. And it recommends the guitar because it gives a very fit accompaniment to a tolerable voice. Well, we've exceeded that today. It's also, I quote, cheap, portable, and as rapturous and romantic as the most resolute enthusiast in sensibility and serenading can desire. Rapturous and romantic. Those may seem rather strong feelings to associate with an instrument you could buy for £1. How could this be? And notice that the writer has no trouble in referring to the guitar as romantic. Well, part of the answer lies in that passing allusion to serenading, which you may have spotted. In 1824, an English journalist dryly commented that, and I quote, "After taking the air in a stiff northeast wind in January, I am fully persuaded that ours is not a serenading climate." And by long tradition, the serenade was, of course, essentially a nocturnal adventure of Spaniards and Italians, that's to say, of those whose climate was imagined by the English, with some reason, as generally warmer and more accommodating than their own. But this was especially a fascination with Spain, a country that seemed both congenial and yet deeply exotic to the English. It was congenial because at times, of course, the Spaniards had been fellow travellers in the struggle against Napoleon during the Peninsular War of 1808 to 1814. But Spain was exotic because it was Latin and Catholic, tinged with legends about the Inquisition, secret prisons, torture, and was widely perceived as being pre-industrial and even quasi-medieval in its social and economic conditions. Not entirely, I think, at this period, without reason. So the guitar was therefore strongly associated with a country where the troubling signs of industrialism, which were blighting the landscape of contemporary England, were hardly to be seen, or so many believed. No one called upon Spain, as John Hanmer summoned England in a sonnet of 1840, to arise up from the smoky cloud that covers thee. There were no developers in Madrid or Valencia like those who were slowly putting an end to John Keats's ambling walk from Hampstead to Walthamstow across the meadows of Hornsey and Tottenham. The guitar, whether used for a serenade or not, is therefore often associated in English fiction of our period with pastoral, or at least non-urban settings and warm Spanish nights with soft musical sounds in the context of a gentle climate and a Mediterranean ecology. Here we are, embowered amid citrons, oranges and myrtles, with the moon gently trembling over the ocean and the ancient turrets of our chateau, runs a passage in one serialized novella of 1811, where guitars are heard on the warm night air. The guitar had exactly the still, small voice to be imagined in such a context. To its critics, of course, that soft sound was calculated, and I quote, "for the space of a sentry box or the back room of a shop in Burlington Arcade." But the softness of the guitar became more and more obvious, both to critics and to advocates, as other instruments gradually became louder. In 1808, the Heather professor at Oxford, William Crotch, observed that it had become the custom in his day to transcribe orchestral works for the piano. He commended the practice, but of course it meant that players had to try and imitate a full orchestral texture by playing quite loudly, and often producing sudden alternations which Crotch did not like between very loud and very soft. And to meet their demands, makers, as many people here will know, I'm sure, began to give pianos cast iron frames, making their manufacture quasi-industrial to support thicker strings of higher tension to make them louder. Violins, it affected other instruments. Violins were given new, more angled necks, higher bridges and higher tension strings to make them louder. and more penetrating. Don't ever be impressed when you hear someone playing a Stradivarius instrument and claiming that this is revealing the genius of Stradivarius. As far as I know, none of the instruments he made exist in anything like the condition they were in when they left his bench. Now, these technological changes, as you can imagine, did much for the volume of the instruments concerned, and indeed for their scope in other ways. But in the judgment of some, they did very little for their appeal to the imagination. Let me quote you an essay from 1836, slightly tongue-in-cheek, I think, but not entirely so. I quote, "It is a pity that, highly cultivated as music is now, so much of its romance should be lost. The most elaborate composition of Mozart or Beethoven will never awake in the youthful heart the feelings inspired by the graceful canzonets and roundelays sung by the accomplished cavaliers and fair ladies of the olden time, and accompanied on the lute, a word in which there is 1,000 times more poetry than in the names of all the instruments in the Philharmonic Orchestra. When we connect romantic associations with the harp or the flute, do we think of the patent double-action harp of Erard or the 10 keys of the instrument played on by Nicholson? As to the violin, king of instruments though it be, the very name is an antidote to every poetical or romantic idea." Now, to Hector Berlioz, who could play the guitar and not much else, the sound of the guitar seemed mélancolique et rêveur. He's one of the few composers of the period to contemplate how you might use the guitar in an orchestra. He's obviously a composer, as everyone knows, very fond of exotic and interesting, unusual sounds. He never did, in fact, compose for it, but it's interesting to know that this is how the sound of the guitar fell upon his ear, a highly intelligent ear, and need hardly be said. Mélancolique et rêveur. Melancholic and dreamy. Dreamy, but dreaming of what? The 18th century had witnessed a massive effort to recover the poetry and story of the Middle Ages and much more. The romances of King Arthur, the tales of chivalry, the legends of ancient Ireland and Scandinavia, the folk tales of Germany, think of the Brothers Grimm, the ballads of the Scottish borders, think of the hunting of the Cheviot, if you know it. Much of this material was remote, fantastical, and permeated to a depth by the supernatural, to a depth that makes the idea of mere magic something you can pick up or put down, as Harry Potter does, seem completely irrelevant. Here was a great wealth of prose, but especially of poetry, quite foreign, really quite foreign to the classical tradition of Greece and Rome, with its values of balance, order, and harmony. When the critic I quoted earlier refers to every romantic idea, he means above all what you might encounter in certain kinds of story, in ballad or romance, in contemporary novels set in the Middle Ages, in serialized stories of love with settings in a time or place remote from the present. And these associations for the guitar were reinforced by cheap prints, such as the one you have on your handout on that second page on the bottom left, where a medieval minstrel plays the guitar to a group of women in a forest scene. You might ask, what is a guitar doing there? Well, evidently to imagine what a minstrel might have played in a world of our own imagination, it was necessary to look beyond the instruments of the orchestra that were so obviously moving forward to embrace new technologies and new techniques of composition requiring resources that the guitar didn't possess. You couldn't look to them. You had to look at an instrument that somehow seemed to embody an older, quieter, less elaborate, perhaps in some ways less sophisticated sound world. And there's something else. Poets of the Romantic period often present the lute, which I should think most of them had never heard, possibly even never seen, as soft and beguiling. For John Keats, the lute is a soft, sighing instrument, and the soft lute. A poem published in Edinburgh in 1793 has the refrain, tells soft lute in plaintive tone, sad Louisa's hapless moan. This all suited the guitar very well. When Berlioz talks about the guitar being mélancolique et rêveur, he means this great high priest of massive orchestral sound means a sound nearing silence, stilling the spirit, scaling down the hearing. The reference you just heard to the hapless moan of a benighted woman brings us directly to some of the darker associations that make the romantic guitar romantic. Let me read you, if I may, a short passage from a novel of 1798. The moon now shone full into the casement, and every sound being hushed, except the light trembling of the leaves that overshadowed the cottage, Laurette intimated a wish to retire, and was conducted by her hostess to her room. As she paused for a moment at the window of the apartment to enjoy the serenity of the scene, the notes of a guitar, accompanied by a female voice that breathed the most affecting sweetness, fixed her to the spot. The air, which was a melancholy one, seemed to have been awakened by no common sorrow. Notice how everything there, absolutely everything, is touched by a certain menace. The scene is night, a time of rest, but also of dream and of nightmare. After all, rêveur, Berlioz's word, has as its root the French word rêve, meaning a dream, and dreams can become nightmares, as Hamlet knew, to sleep perchance a dream. Aye, there's the rub. The moon in the passage is full, the moon of the lunatic in the strict sense. The window is a casement, not a sash, so this is an old house, and may conceal secrets as dark as the night. The leaves on the trees don't move in the wind, they tremble like a fearful person, and they overshadow the house. The guitar accompanies a woman's voice that breathes the most affecting sweetness, but the air is a melancholy one, expressing no common sorrow. And we soon learn that the guitarist and singer is a young woman who had met with disappointment in the tender passion which had occasioned the loss of her senses. So we're passing beyond melancholy to madness, lunacy even, and this will reach its pathological extreme with the male guitar player of Edgar Allan Poe's The Fall of the House of Usher from 1839. I quote you. I've just spoken of that morbid condition of the auditory nerve which rendered all music intolerable to my friend, with the exception of certain effects of stringed instruments. It was perhaps the narrow limits to which he thus confined himself upon the guitar which gave birth in great measure to the fantastic character of the performances. They must have been the result of the highest artificial excitement. Well, you may think that the very fraught imagining of Poe in The Fall of the House of Usher wanders very far from the world of actual performance and song with the guitar. Well, I concede it does, but not as far as you might suppose. Here's the text of the song you're about to hear. Oft in the stilly night, ere slumber's chain has bound me, fond memory brings the light of other days around me, the smiles, the tears of boyhood years, the words of love then spoken, the eyes that shone, now dimmed and gone, the cheerful hearts now broken. When I remember all the friends so linked together I've seen around me fall like leaves in wintry weather, I feel like one who treads alone some banquet hall deserted, whose lights are fled, whose garlands dead, and all but he departed. Listen to it all. Death, loneliness, wintry age are the themes. And notice how in that poem there's a banquet hall. There are lights and garlands. This is a quasi-medieval setting, just as in The Fall of the House of Usher, where the narrator meets his friend by entering the Gothic archway of the hall with sombre tapestries and armorial trophies. Here's the song. And what I'm sure you will notice is that the music offers very, very little response to what I've been evoking. The music, like so much of the accompanied guitar song from England at this time, is rather serene, really rather sentimental, perhaps slightly cloying. And I use that to make my point that what is romantic about the romantic guitar is often not the music. Symptoms of what you might want to call romantic musical style come to the guitar very late. But that's not the point. There are ways of thinking about it as a romantic instrument that are nothing to do with music, though they sometimes come into contact with it. Here is Oft in the Stilly Night. The last item on your handout, the picture to the bottom right, comes from one of the published albums and annuals of the late Georgian years. This striking image of Catherine Airlie, you can see the guitar there, appeared with Fisher's Drawing Room Scrapbook as a kind of giveaway, free gift, in 1844. And an accompanying poem leaves no doubt about the painfulness of Catherine's history. A rose, you notice, has fallen from the vase onto her table as a discreet symbol of approaching mortality. The accompanying verses, written by a woman, run, "Oh, take that picture from the wall, dark shadow o'er my soul doth fall, the past returneth all, why didst thou die so early? I dare not look upon thy face, grief rends my heart like black disgrace, I think upon the last embrace, ill-fated Catherine Airlie. Listen to all that. Dark shadow, grief, black disgrace. My final word, before we have some questions, if you'd like to have them, is that the guitar of the 1820s and 30s was the romantic guitar because, in one sense, of its associations with the Mediterranean distant landscapes of an exotic Spain and with a vision of the Middle Ages, which, of course, emerges so sublimely in, let's say, John Keats' St. Agnes' Eve. Its sound was softer than any other instrument in common use, and it followed a different line of musical and associative development to the piano or the orchestral instruments. Reading about those orchestral instruments is like finding a box full of old scores and newspaper cuttings in the attic. Reading about the guitar in writings of the period, at least for me, has been like discovering a case of old lantern slides, a store of strange and highly coloured images, narratives, folklore almost, antiquated but very alluring, dusty but brilliant when held up to the light. But there is also something dark. As the picture of Catherine Airlie suggests, the guitar was sometimes drawn into the contemporary preoccupation with the abandonment, captivity, and indeed the suffering of women. Such themes find expression, don't they, above all, in the Gothic novels of the period, so emphatically concerned with imprisonment, with hysteria, the supernatural and madness. Open perhaps the most famous of all Gothic novels in English, The Mysteries of Udolpho by Anne Radcliffe, published in 1794, and you'll find it has no pianos, it has no violins, and no harps with the Erard action, but it does have a guitar, and that says a great deal. And here is our final piece. This was published in London in 1809, and the text in French, Je suis encore dans mon printemps. So I'm keeping the slightly dark tone, but perhaps lifting it a little. I am still, as yet, in my springtime. Published in London in 1809.
Je suis encore dans mon abandonné et sans défense au pays impie du tyran au me confine de l'enfance. Vous qui protégez les amours, venez, venez au mon secours, venez, venez au mon secours, venez, venez au mon secours, venez, venez au mon secours. Dans la contrée haute des pays ensoleillés, je vais toujours l'enchaîner. Je les secours à tout m'amener, comme pour le plaisir je suis libre. Vous qui protégez les amours, venez, venez au mon secours, venez, venez au mon secours, venez, venez au mon secours, venez, venez au mon secours. Que le vous enivre mon cruel rapport, que une plaisance trouve réchauffé le bonheur après son si dur esclavage. Vous qui protégez les amours, venez, venez au mon secours, venez, venez Oh,